All right, let's dive right into language learning. I know a lot of you out there want to learn a new language quickly and effectively, and I think we've got some pretty interesting stuff to share from this learner's diary. It's got tips on vocab, pronunciation, how to actually get to speaking, grammar, even dealing with mistakes.
You know what's interesting about this is it's a firsthand account, right? We're not just talking theory here. We're actually seeing how these techniques work for somebody in real life.
Yeah, it's like a backstage pass to their language journey. And the first thing I noticed, they were all about reading to build vocab. They actually say you learn twice as fast just by reading.
And there's actually research that backs that up.
Really?
Yeah, studies show that reading a lot, like really immersing yourself in it, exposes you to a ton of vocab. But, and this is important, it's in context, right? So it's not just memorizing words in isolation. It's seeing how they're actually used naturally.
So it helps you understand it better and remember it.
I think
Okay, so the source suggests shooting for at least 30 minutes of reading each day. And get this, they say ditch the word lists.
oh, yeah.
They found more success just looking up words as they came across them in the text.
Makes sense when you think about how our brains work, right? You see a word a bunch of times in different situations. You start to get a feel for how it's used, how it fits in a sentence.
Yeah.
It's way better than just trying to memorize a list.
It's like putting together a puzzle instead of just staring at a pile of pieces.
Perfect analogy.
So put down the flashcards, pick up a book. Speaking of puzzles, let's move on to pronunciation. The diary talks about this thing called shadowing, which is basically copying native speakers in real time.
Might sound a little strange,
Yeah.
but think about how kids learn language. They listen to their parents, try to copy the sounds. Shadowing kind of taps into that.
Like a natural instinct we all have.
Exactly.
There's this cool story in the diary about a student from South Korea who had trouble with pronunciation. They said shadowing helped a ton, like it retrained their tongue and mouth to make the sounds, right?
It's not just about individual sounds, though.
Right.
It's also the rhythm, intonation, the flow of the language. It's like training your speech muscles to dance to a new tune.
Okay, are you ready for what the source calls the secret weapon?
I'm intrigued.
It's called thinking aloud. Now, before you picture me talking to myself in the grocery store, hear me out.
Okay, I'm listening.
It's really about getting your brain to think in the language you're learning. You start by saying simple thoughts out loud, and then you make them more complex as you go.
Like a warm-up for your brain before a workout.
Exactly. And the diary gives this amazing example of how it works in real life. There's a woman named Monica who learned English at home using this thinking aloud technique along with reading and shadowing. And guess what? She was able to have fluent conversations with native speakers.
Wow, that's amazing.
I know, right? It shows you the power of practice and really getting the language into your system. By thinking and speaking in English all the time, she didn't have to translate everything in her head anymore, so her speech just flowed naturally.
That's the dream, isn't it?
So let's get down to brass tacks. Where do we even begin with this thinking aloud thing? And is it really as awkward as it sounds?
Well, the good news is you can start small. Just describe stuff around you, then try narrating what you're doing. Eventually, you can even have little debates or speeches in your head, all in the language you're learning. And remember, nobody's listening. It's just you and your brain, your own personal rehearsal space.
So no pressure.
None at all.
I've got to say, grammar rules have always kind of tripped me up. They just seem so boring and confusing. But this diary makes a pretty good point about learning grammar naturally just by being exposed to the language.
Totally.
Yeah.
The author's all about just observing how words are used in real situations, like when you're reading or listening. It's like cracking the code without having to memorize a bunch of rules.
Speaking of real life situations, the diary talks about this interesting experience the author had at a job center.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and it really shows how important it is to get out there and actually use the language.
So what happened?
Well, the learner was really proactive. They didn't just wait for opportunities to come to them. They went out looking for a place where they could practice their English. And by doing that, they picked up a lot of practical vocab and phrases just naturally.
So they immerse themselves in the language.
Exactly. And their efforts paid off because they ended up getting a job at a cafe.
Wow, talk about a perfect place to practice speaking.
Right. The diary mentions that their boss was really patient and encouraging, which is so important when you're learning.
Definitely. Having a supportive environment where you feel comfortable making mistakes is huge. It lets you try new things and improve without feeling judged.
And speaking of supportive environments, the diary introduces us to another student, Monica. She's in the same English class as the author, and she's incredibly fluent.
Oh, wow.
It turns out she had taken a class with the same teacher before, and she credits her progress to the techniques she learned there.
That's awesome. So she's like a success story for this method.
Yeah, and what's even more impressive is that she learned mostly at home, using reading, shadowing, and you guessed it, thinking aloud.
It just goes to show that if you put in the effort and use the right methods, you can really achieve fluency.
And I love what Monica says about thinking in English without translating. That's the holy grail, right?
Absolutely. It's like the language becomes second nature to you.
So the diary explains that the teacher encourages students to just embrace the awkwardness of thinking aloud at first and start small, like just with simple sentences.
Right.
And then as they get more confident, they can build up to more complex thoughts and
Looks
expressions.
like working out a muscle, right?
Yeah,
You start with lighter weights and gradually increase as you get stronger.
I love that analogy. It makes the whole process seem a lot less intimidating.
Yeah.
And the diary also points out that thinking aloud can help you get over the fear of making mistakes, which can be a big roadblock for a lot of learners.
Yeah, I can see how that would be helpful.
By saying their thoughts out loud, people become less self-conscious about their pronunciation and grammar. It's like taking the pressure off and just allowing yourself to play with the language.
Yeah, it makes sense.
The author of the diary admits that they felt a little intimidated by their lack of grammar knowledge, but the teacher assures them that reading and shadowing give them plenty of exposure to grammatical structures, especially for everyday conversation.
Which is really what matters most, right? Being able to communicate.
Exactly. And remember that website we mentioned earlier, www.grammarinlevels.com?
Yeah.
Well, the author found it really helpful for brushing up on specific grammar concepts that were relevant to their level.
So they're taking a well-rounded approach.
Definitely. They're combining practical experience with targeted resources.
Mm.
And speaking of practical experience, the diary shares this really heartwarming story about a breakthrough moment the author had while working at the cafe.
Ooh, tell me about it. I love those aha moments.
Well, one of their classmates complimented them on their improved pronunciation, and it suddenly hit them that all that shadowing they'd been doing over the weekend had actually made a difference.
It's those little wins that keep us going.
For sure. It's proof that consistent effort pays off. And talking about tracking progress, the author wanted to measure their vocabulary growth. So they mentioned this website called www.testlanguages.com, which has a vocab test.
That's a great way to see how far you've come and what areas you still need to work on.
And it's got to be motivating to see how much your vocabulary has expanded over time.
Oh, yeah.
The diary says the author was surprised to find out they knew around 2,100 words.
That's amazing. That's a solid foundation.
It really shows that they've been working hard and using the right techniques.
Definitely. But like with any learning process, there are going to be bumps along the way. And the diary doesn't shy away from one of the biggest fears people have when learning a language, making mistakes.
Yeah, that's a tough one. That fear of sounding stupid or messing up can really hold you back.
Absolutely. But the diary has this really cool perspective on mistakes, one that can actually free you from that fear.
Mm.
It's all about shifting your focus from perfection to communication. The author's teacher, they have this really interesting way of looking at it. They compare language learning to like a little kid, maybe 2 years old, just starting to talk. And those kids, they're not afraid to try. They just want to get their point across.
Right, they're not worried about being perfect, they just want to communicate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as adults, we get so caught up in trying to be perfect, we forget about that.
We get scared of messing up, so we don't even try.
That's the thing. So instead of stressing about every little grammar rule or your accent, just try to shift your thinking. Focus on getting your message across, having a real conversation,
It's about the connection, not the perfection.
Right.
Yeah.
And the diary actually suggests something really simple for reducing mistakes naturally.
What's that?
Reading aloud.
Oh, yeah.
It might seem basic, but it really works. You're reinforcing correct pronunciation, grammar, and you're training your mouth to speak more smoothly.
It's like a language workout, hitting all the important areas.
Exactly.
And the diary makes this point that even in real conversations, don't let the fear of making a mistake stop you. Just focus on sharing ideas, connecting with the other person.
That's what it's all about, right?
Yeah.
Language is how we connect, how we share who we are.
Yeah, don't let fear get in the way of that.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So to sum up this deep dive, I think the biggest takeaway is enjoy the journey, be patient with yourself, and remember why you're doing this, to communicate.
And don't forget, those mistakes, they're actually helping you learn and grow.
They're like little signposts pointing you in the right direction.
Now, before we wrap up completely, I want to leave you with something to think about. Imagine yourself a year from now having a conversation with a native speaker in the language you're learning. What would you talk about? Why? Hold on to that image, let it motivate you, and just watch your language skills blossom.
That's a great thought to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into language learning. Until next time, happy learning, everybody.